The humble fish and chips. It's not entirely clear how, or even when, this quaint but filling little meal became the official dish of the people of the British Isles. But what is known is that during the first half of the 20th century, it had become as quintessentially British as cricket and the royal family. One of the most common types of fish to be included in the meal was cod, found in the North Sea, and British fishing trawlers scoured the region between Scotland and Iceland in pursuit of this seemingly unlimited resource of the sea. However, by the middle of the 20th century, it would be the pursuit of this innocuous fish that would lead to a series of diplomatic crises, and at times confrontations on the stormy, strategically important northern waters that, if weren't managed properly, threatened to escalate out of control and possibly even drag in the superpowers. It is a David and Goliath story where a small fleet of Icelandic Coast Guard patrol boats squared up to the mighty Royal Navy, who found their hands tied by regulations and changing attitudes and laws that proved that sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword. It was a series of phony wars where pride, principle, and the rule of law, and yes, fish, resulted in piracy, deliberate ramming of ships, and even the firing of guns at one another. And all of this was taking place in a strategically vital place of the world, caught up in the nuclear brinkmanship of the Cold War. Today we are going to examine the Cod Wars between Iceland and the United Kingdom, and how they impacted the nations involved and beyond. Welcome to Wars of the World. As an island nation, the UK has always naturally viewed the oceans as a major resource with which to feed its population, especially as said population began swelling considerably in the 18th and 19th centuries. Fishing fleets emerged all over the UK's coastline, and numerous towns and cities began to build around this industry. Located on the northeast coast of England, in Yorkshire, is the city of Kingston upon Hull, but known simply as Hull. And it was from here, the Lincolnshire city of Grimsby, that the bulk of Britain's fleet of offshore fishing trawlers rose to prominence in the late 19th century. The fleets were originally engaged in whaling, but when that industry declined, they began to focus more and more on trawling the waters north of the British Isles, around Iceland. The arrival of steam-powered vessels meant that the wind was no longer a factor in when they could get to sea. And as long as there was coal for the furnace, the ships could be out fishing. It was a boom time for the British offshore fleet, especially thanks to the growing cod trade, but it was hard work, and only the toughest men would make it to the highly coveted position of captain of an offshore fishing trawler. Few men were as respected in their communities as the captains, known as the skippers, but were you to bump into one on the street, he may not be what you expected him to look like. Reflecting their status, trawler captains on shore were often dressed more like bank managers in fine suits, smart shoes, and they were well groomed. Yet make no mistake, becoming a captain did not mean that you were on easy street. Earning that position was one thing, but keeping it was quite another, and competition was fierce, with captains often pushing their men and their vessels to breaking point to bring in the catch. Not even 2 world wars stopped the fleets from going out, and fish was one of the few widely available foods in a Britain being starved to death by the U-boats, who also took to shelling the fishing boats. When the Second World War had ended, the British people were very mindful of the contribution which the fishing fleets had made to keep them alive. Iceland, meanwhile, was the subject of the Danish crown throughout the 19th century, but its importance was often overlooked, it being sparsely populated and its climate extremely inhospitable and prone to volcanic eruptions. As more and more people emigrated from Iceland to both Canada and the United States, its population fluctuated throughout the period around the 70,000 mark, which for perspective was roughly the equivalent of Grimsby alone, despite the country being nearly half the size of Britain. The people of this harsh land soon developed a sense of identity, and a form of nationalism developed as they sought for greater autonomy from Denmark, until on December 1st, 1918, the country achieved full home rule before becoming a republic in 1944. As an independent nation, Iceland had to establish its own economy, but with difficult terrain for farming or industry, and with a population literally less than that of most small European cities, the young country found itself relying heavily on the rich oceans around it, with fishing eventually representing some 89% of the economy. But even then, it was the foreign boats from the UK, Belgium, Norway and West Germany that made the most from the region, despite being prohibited from fishing within 3 miles of the Icelandic coast. One thing in their favour, however, was the popularity of cod in the war-ravaged United Kingdom, in need of a filling, tasty but cheap diet. Between 1950 and 1970, the UK consumed around 430,000 tonnes of cod annually, and when their own fishing fleets couldn't provide the full tally, UK markets turned to the Icelandic fleet for help, with the UK quickly becoming Iceland's biggest export for the fish. While this was going on, Iceland made a major impact on the world stage in the growing troubles of the Cold War between the democratic West and the communist East by signing up to NATO. This not only allowed NATO ships and aircraft to operate from Iceland, but also afforded its tiny population enormous military protection, akin to any other country in Western Europe. A key component of Iceland's involvement in NATO was the establishment of a major airbase for the US Navy at Keflavik, with the US assuming responsibility for Iceland's defense and security. The base at Keflavik would come to be one of the most important in NATO. The warships and submarines of the Soviet Northern Fleet were handicapped by the location of their bases, which meant that if war ever broke out in Europe, they would have to sail through the area between the UK, Iceland and Greenland in order to threaten convoys crossing the North Atlantic, with reinforcements from the US and Canada. This became known as the Gruik Gap, and Keflavik helped plug the middle of it with its force of maritime patrol and electronic surveillance aircraft. As the Soviets began deploying ballistic missile submarines armed with nuclear missiles, the importance of the base increased. The issues of the fishing rights, however, were becoming an increasingly sore subject, not just for the Icelandic people, but around Europe generally. The UK found themselves locked in a legal dispute with Norway in the late 1940s over fishing rights off the Norwegian coast, with the International Court of Justice ruling in favour of Norway. Encouraged by this, the Icelandic people, who felt that they were being robbed of their main resource by the overfishing in waters they viewed as their own, began making efforts to restrict foreign, mostly British trawlers around their own coastline. This was only spurred on by the growing fear that if the British and a handful of other European nations continued producing harvests as large as they had been, then the stocks of cod in particular would run dry, which would be devastating on Iceland's economy. Even with the 3-mile limit in place, an agreement between Denmark and the UK, while Iceland was still Danish land, allowed British trawlers to seek shelter from storms within this limit, provided that they stowed their fishing gear. This meant that in some of the worst weather, the trawlers were spared from having to return home, and from the costs which would incur from both fuel and a lack of catch. Not only did the Icelandics no longer view the agreement as legitimate, with it being made by what was now another country, but they additionally planned to extend the fishing limit by 1 mile from 3 to 4. This new limit came into force on May 15, 1952. This didn't massively impact the British trawler fleet in terms of catch, but the new Icelandic position forbade them from sheltering during storms. Flags aboard hundreds of British trawlers were lowered to half-mast, and the day became known in fishing circles as Black Thursday. Public anger forced the British government to enter into a series of negotiations to come to an agreement with Iceland to settle this dispute. When these talks appeared to be going nowhere, the British imposed a ban on the import of Icelandic fish to the UK, hoping to hurt the Icelandic economy and force them to at least return to the old terms. The Icelandic people were furious at this, since if left unresolved, it threatened to cripple the Icelandic economy. It is here that the wider world view came into play, and tipped the balance away from the UK's favour. While much of the world was paying little attention to what seemed like nothing more than a simple legal dispute, the Soviet Union sensed an opportunity to curry favour with the Icelandic government, which could, in the long run, undermine NATO's influence, maybe even leading to the closure of Keflavik Air Base. While not having any real need for the fish, given their own vast stocks, the Soviets nevertheless began buying up the Icelandic fish banned by Britain. Realizing what was happening, the US also began buying up the fish stocks to undermine the Soviet effort and to gain influence with Iceland. Thus, rather than being punished, Britain's ban on Icelandic fish actually saw two major economic powers pouring money into the country, which negated any meaningful long-term impact that would have taken place and severely weakened Britain's negotiating position. By 1956, the Organisation for European Economic Cooperation, a spiritual forerunner to today's European Union, which both Iceland and the UK were members of, agreed to support Iceland's position. Britain reluctantly gave up on its ambitions to get Iceland's decision reversed, but this didn't stop some British trawler captains from continuing to enter the new 4-mile limit. The early fines imposed on trawlers found within the limits were not always offset by the potential rewards of a successful catch, and thus began a game of cat and mouse between the British trawlermen and the Icelandic Coast Guard. This further enraged the Icelandic government, who began increasing the fines, both as a way of discouraging the incursions and financing the enforcement of the new 4-mile limit. While the whole affair isn't considered to be one of the Cod Wars, it would provide a taste of the sometimes extraordinary events which were about to occur. With the end of the Second World War, the start of the Cold War, and the rise of the United Nations as an international legal body, the post-war world underwent dramatic changes compared to previous decades, and with regards to how disputes were handled and settled. Nowhere was this more obvious than the growing use and harvesting of the seas. Laws governing territorial rights to the seas were not particularly clear, although generally speaking, they conformed to a decision by the Dutch juror and philosopher Hugo Grotius, considered by many to be the father of international law. He ruled in 1609 that the sea should be open to anyone with peaceful intent, and this helped coin the policy of the freedom of the seas. This policy was generally agreed upon by all seafaring nations, as to oppose it would likely result in other nations in turn imposing their own restrictions, and ultimately it would lead to only the strongest nations holding dominion over the oceans. However, it was also agreed that it was not in the best interest of any nation that ships should be allowed to sail right up to their coastline without any permission, as this could invite sneak attacks. Therefore, another Dutchman, the legal theorist Cornelius van Bindershoek, who in 1702 drafted a rule that a nation's claim to the seas be limited to the range of a cannon shell fired off of land. This translated into a range of 3 nautical miles, and this was generally accepted the world over until the middle of the 20th century, where the previous rulebook seemed to have gone out the window. And there were now nations actively seeking to claim the seas tens or even hundreds of miles from their shore. Recognizing the risks to the peace such territorial claims presented, in 1958, the United Nations chaired the first Law of the Sea Conference, which was aimed at setting boundaries for this expansion, and among the members participating was Iceland. Fresh off their victory in 1956, Iceland, which had recently elected a left-leaning government, came to the table with new demands against British and other European fishermen operating around their lands. They wanted to establish an Economic Exclusion Zone, or EEZ, that would now prevent foreign fishing vessels from operating within a 12-mile limit of their coast, an increase of 200%. Having been forced to agree to the previous limit, the UK government and their fishing fleets were furious and refused to agree to abide by these demands. The UN were unable to come to a firm conclusion on numerous issues which the convention was expected to address, including Iceland's extension. And so, at midnight on September 1st, 1958, the Icelandic government made the 12-mile limit law, regardless of the view by the international community. European condemnation of this move by Iceland was widespread, and as well as the expected protests from countries such as the UK, many NATO countries also expressed their disapproval of Iceland's claim. But the government in Reykjavik, Iceland's capital, stood firm and warned that any non-Icelandic fishing vessels found within 12 miles of their coast would be seized and their captains fined or imprisoned. But London was unwilling to budge as well, citing the Icelandic claim to be a violation of international law, and that the British trawlers had historical claims to the region. Thus, while both sides tried to find a diplomatic solution, London refused to stop its trawlers from fishing up to the previous 4-mile limit. The Icelandic Coast Guard were equipped with 6 small gunboats and a single PBY Catalina flying boat to enforce the new EEZ, and they would be facing down many times their own number in terms of British trawlers. But the belief was that if they made a strong enough showing early on, then it would discourage other boats from fishing within their new limits. However, the Icelandic Coast Guard had failed to appreciate the determination of the British trawler skippers, many of whom were war veterans, having faced down German U-boats. There was also the matter of having to maintain their position within their trawler fleets, something that required a good reputation for bringing the fish home. Therefore, many of the British skippers saw the current diplomatic crisis as a way of making a name for themselves and securing their careers by taking their boats into the new limits in search of the cod. The Icelandic Coast Guard therefore went into action against them, but when they radioed the British trawlers demanding they identify themselves and then follow them into the harbour, they got a rather raucous response over the radio. The British trawler crews would respond by blasting recordings of Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory over the airwaves, and continued on with their fishing. In response, the Icelandic Coast Guard began boarding trawlers to seize them and take them into port. From the British perspective, this was tantamount to piracy, and the only response was to deploy the Royal Navy to protect the British fishermen in 3 key fishing areas: the West Fjords north of Horn and southeast of Iceland. It would not be long before the inevitable first encounter between the Icelandic Coast Guard and the Royal Navy. Just 3 days after the Icelandic government declared the new zone as being in effect, the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Aegir attempted to seize a British trawler operating off West Fjords within the 12-mile limit, when it was blocked by the anti-submarine frigate HMS Russell. Both vessels collided in the process, although not to such an extent as to seriously threaten either. This was the first collision between the two sides, but it would be by no means the last. On September 10th, the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Thor was in the process of boarding the trawler Northern Foam when the frigate HMS Eastbourne intervened. The captain of Thor refused instructions from the Eastbourne to withdraw his men, and so a British boarding party went aboard to take the Icelandic boarding party into custody. The Icelandic Coast Guard men became guests of the crew of the Eastbourne, and both crews were cordial to one another, while the British warship sailed into Keflavik to hand them over to the Americans. The British response of sending in warships produced an angry mob outside the British embassy in Reykjavik, protesting the heavy-handedness of London. British Ambassador Sir Andrew Gilchrist decided to respond to the protests by playing loud music from his gramophone, including recordings of bagpipe music from his native land of Scotland. As comical as it may have seemed to many outsiders, the growing dispute of what was soon being described in the British press as the Cod War was rattling the nerves of the NATO alliance, as 2 key members, one for its military and political assets and one for its strategic location, were in conflict with one another. This situation only seemed to worsen as the days went by, until on October 6th, the Icelandic vessel Maria Julia attempted to board the trawler Kingston Emerald. Again, the British trawler refused to accept that it was fishing illegally, and in response, the Maria Julia opened fire, sending 3 shells in the direction of the British vessel, whose captain immediately turned out to sea. This was seen as a worrying escalation, so that each encounter between the two sides became more and more tense, as one mistake could lead to both sides shooting at one another. Against this backdrop, on November 12th, the Icelandic vessel Thor encountered the trawler Hackness and ordered it to stop so that it could be boarded. The captain of the Hackness refused, prompting the Thor to fire 2 blank rounds and 1 live warning shot off its bow. Hackness finally stopped, But then HMS Russell appeared on the scene and issued warning to the Icelandic vessel not to intervene with the Hackness, as it was not within the 4-mile limit officially recognized by the British government. The captain of the Thor ignored the Russell and ordered his men to approach the trawler with their gun manned. This forced the captain of HMS Russell to have his own guns readied for action, threatening to sink the Icelandic boat if it fired at the Hackness. During the resulting standoff, additional British vessels headed into the area, and realizing that he couldn't hope to match up to the Russell, let alone the approaching vessels, the Icelandic Coast Guard captain allowed the Hackness to leave the area unmolested. It was clear to everyone that if they wished to, the Royal Navy could just blast the entire Icelandic Coast Guard out of the water in just less than a day. But politically, of course, that was totally out of the question. While the British did have the firepower to protect their fishing vessels, they were also showing enormous restraint in their handling of the incidents. This left the Icelandic guardsmen wondering just what were the Royal Navy's orders in dealing with this crisis, and how far could they push the British sailors before they started shooting, and how would either side be viewed after the fact. Therefore, the Icelandic Coast Guard adopted a new policy of keeping meticulously detailed records of trawlers operating, in their view, illegally in their waters, building up evidence of an international criminal case. Meanwhile, policymakers in London were getting extremely nervous about the costs of Royal Navy operations in terms of money, fuel, manpower, and resources, all of which were in increasingly short supply for a cash-strapped post-war Britain. Within 5 months of the start of the Royal Navy deployment, Lord Carrington, the First Lord of the Admiralty, reported that the fleet had used £500,000 worth of fuel, this being approximately £9.7 million in 2021. All of this to deploy some 37 warships and 7,000 sailors to ward off just 6 Icelandic gunboats and their combined crews of 100 men. This cost was added to Britain's part within NATO in containing the Soviet Union, relations with whom were on a seemingly endless spiral downwards at the start of the 1960s. With the British refusing to budge, the Icelandics felt that they had no choice but to play the only card left in their hand. They threatened to close the NATO base at Keflavik and to expel the American personnel stationed there. This would have been disastrous for NATO's position in controlling the approaches to the Soviet fleet's northern submarine bases. NATO therefore began mediating in the dispute, but it was clear to all that Iceland's position had become significantly stronger due to NATO's intervention. First and foremost, NATO needed to keep Keflavik open and Iceland on side. The UK wasn't about to back out of NATO over rights to fishing grounds, and so all the Icelandics had to do was to hold their nerve during the mediations. Finally, in February 1961, an agreement was reached, which saw the formal recognition of a 12 nautical mile or 22-kilometer limit on non-Icelandic fishing vessels. However, the Icelandics did make one concession, and that was to permit British fishing trawlers to operate in selected zones in certain seasons up to the outer 6 nautical mile or 11-kilometer limit within Iceland's EEZ for up to 3 years. Additionally, both sides agreed that any future disagreements concerning fishing rights would be settled at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Efforts to sell the deal in Britain as a mutually beneficial agreement fell on deaf ears, and it was seen as defeat by the British trawler crews, which of course it very much was. The Cod War was over, but while the British trawler fleet had taken a hit, they had at least survived and were still fishing the rich grounds south of Iceland up to the 12-mile limit without interference. Things appeared to be settled down as the 1960s wore on, and the biggest concerns for Britain were the Cold War, economic recovery from the Second World War, and growing troubles in Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, British fishermen were still bitter over the loss of the Cod War and what it meant for their industry, but most were now content to remain outside the 12-mile limit. However, unbeknownst to many in Europe at the time, things beneath the waves were taking a dramatic turn. The seas between Iceland and Norway were rich with herring, and like the cod industry in the UK, was highly profitable for the Scandinavian fishing industry. The effectiveness of Scandinavian fishing boats had been greatly increased by new technologies that not only allowed them to track huge scores of herring under the water using sonar, allowing them to hunt down their catch, but also to process them at sea using factory ships, which improved the quality of the catch and increased the time to market. The mid-1960s saw a boom period as a result, with a staggering 2 million tons of herring caught in 1966. But this could never last. Just as dramatic as the boom in catch was the bust. With the herring population being savaged in such a way, there were fewer mature enough fish to repopulate the species, and the numbers plummeted. Just 5 years after the record-breaking catch, the number of herring being brought in now just barely tipped the scales at 20,000 tons. Coupled with climate change that was taking place in the region and affecting repopulation, the herring was expected to be extinct by the end of the decade, and this forced strict reductions on the amount of herring that could be caught every year to allow the fish numbers to build back up, something that would take 20 years. In that time, of course, the Scandinavian fishing fleet, built up around herring, was itself made all but extinct, with it suffering massive job losses and huge losses of revenue. This, of course, was bad enough for Norway, but it was almost an apocalyptic prospect for Iceland's tiny population, nearly 80% of whom relied on the fishing industry, which was weakened by the herring shortage. If cod stocks went the same way, it could collapse the economy. British and Icelandic scientists began monitoring cod levels, and to their horror, a similar thing was happening to the cod as with the Scandinavian herring, with cod numbers between 1970 and 1972 dropping by almost a third. Something had to be done to prevent the Icelandic cod industry from collapsing, and so Iceland elected to extend its economic exclusion zone from 12 miles to 50 miles. Unsurprisingly, this was met with a hostile reaction from much of Europe, including nations that were part of NATO's military opponent, the Warsaw Pact. They argued that if Iceland was allowed to maintain this sized EEZ, then it would set a precedent for other European nations to do the same, thus strangling other fishing fleets. As per their agreement with Britain in 1961, Iceland agreed to make their case to the International Court of Justice at The Hague to rule on the dispute. But even before attending, the Icelandic government declared that regardless of The Hague's ruling, it would impose a 50-mile EEZ to protect the cod stocks and the Icelandic economy. Iceland argued that the 50-mile limit was necessary to control fishing in the area off of the north and the east coast of Iceland, where the main cod nurseries were located. This would help make the cod stocks more sustainable in the long run. The UK government, meanwhile, under the premiership of Conservative Edward Heath, offered to make concessions that would allow British trawlers to go on fishing, but Iceland refused to budge. This led to many in Britain accusing Iceland of acting illegally, and even that the current Icelandic government, under Ólafur Jóhannsson's Progressive Party, are being involved in a Marxist conspiracy to weaken NATO. The ICJ ruled in Britain's favour, but of course this mattered little to Iceland, who voted the new 50-mile EEZ into their law, declaring it in effect from September 1st, 1972, and thus the Second Cod War began. With Britain refusing to recognise the new limits, British trawlers continued operating between 12 and 50 miles of the coast. Remembering how the Icelandic Coast Guard had made meticulous lists of vessels during the previous Cod War, the British trawler crews painted over their names and numbers on their boats, and even took to hoisting the Jolly Roger flag. This confused many of the men of the Icelandic Coast Guard, as they had become so familiar with the British vessels, many of which were built before the Second World War, that they recognised them by design alone. Fearing boarding, the British trawlermen took to covering nets over the side of their hulls and rigging to prevent any Coast Guardsmen from climbing onto their deck. Some crews went a step further and even fashioned spears with which to puncture the lining of any rubber dinghy trying to come alongside. This time, the British trawlermen were ready for a fight, but they were unaware that Iceland was about to change the rules of the game. Britain was by no means the only one affected by the new limit, And as September 1st came, the West German government deployed 3 ocean-going tugboats to protect their trawlers operating in the region. The tugboats had reinforced hulls that not only made them suitable for operating in the harsh environment of the waters around Iceland, but could better allow them to survive collisions or even deliberate rammings as they blocked any boarding attempts by the Icelandic Coast Guard. They were also seen as more politically palatable than sending in warships. The British fishing companies who owned the boats also demanded protection, but London was still hoping for a diplomatic solution. Then on September 5th, 1972, the fishing trawler Peter Scott was spotted by the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Aegir, a newer vessel than the previous one of the same name. Expecting the Icelandic Coast Guard to attempt to board them, the crew of the Peter Scott was surprised to see Aegir sail behind them perpendicular to their course, trailing a wire in the water. Suddenly, the tension in the wires hauling the net behind them gave way, and they realized that they had just lost their entire catch. The Icelandic Coast Guard had for the first time just used their ultimate weapon for enforcing their new EEZ, the net cutter. With the loss of their catch and the expensive nets, coupled with the time it would take to repair and redeploy the nets, which just added to the time that they were at sea, the crew of the Peter Scott were furious. They yelled insults over the radio, and then closed in on the Coast Guard vessel to throw anything they had at it, even including a fire axe. While the Icelandic government saw the use of the net cutter as an ideal way to enforce their EEZ without the dangers of a boarding party attempting to seize the trawler, or by firing on it with their guns, condemnation of its use was widespread, and not just on economic grounds. The tension in the wires dragging the fishing nets behind a trawler was such that they feared the cut wire snapping back towards the trawler and seriously injuring any fishermen on deck. This fear came true on November 25th, 1972, when the Icelandic Coast Guard cut the nets of the West German trawler Erlingen. A crew member on board was knocked back by the wire, causing him to suffer a fractured skull. The Icelandic Coast Guard retorted, claiming that such incidents were rare, and that cutting the nets so far down would mean that the seawater would significantly dampen the energy as the cable snapped back. If that were not enough, then they also added that under Icelandic law, they shouldn't have been fishing there anyway. Over the coming months, the Icelandic Coast Guard would cut 82 nets from foreign fishing vessels, 18 in a single day alone in January 1973. British trawlermen were now as furious with the lackluster response they got from the British government as they were with the Icelandic Coast Guard for cutting their nets. After threatening to stop going to sea, which would have been politically as well as economically costly to Heath's government, a protection force was assembled for the trawlers. The trawlermen wanted frigates. Instead, they got tugboats. The Lloydsman and the Statesman were 2 large tugboats who were tasked with running interference whenever the Icelandic Coast Guard turned up, attempting to cut the nets of any British trawlers. The tugboats operated on 2-month patrols, changing crews at Greenock in Scotland, before heading back out with the trawlers. Despite their impressive appearance, with the Lloydsman being Britain's biggest tugboat at the time, the British trawlermen were dubious of how effective they could be. As well as being unarmed, they were also slower than the Icelandic Coast Guard vessels, which meant that there was always the possibility that they could outmaneuver the tugs. Regardless, they were better than no protection at all. As the tugboats began their protection duties, the British fishermen were given something of a reprieve when on January 25th, 1973, the volcano on the Icelandic island of Heimaey erupted, prompting a massive evacuation, tying up nearly the entire Icelandic Coast Guard fleet. However, by May 1973, they were back in action against the trawlers, prompting an intense round of negotiations between London and Reykjavik. However, as the negotiations began, news was filtering in that the Icelandic Coast Guard was still cutting nets even as the two sides spoke, making the negotiations all the more difficult. With talking going nowhere and their safety and livelihoods at risk, the British trawlermen had finally had their fill and refused to go to sea without adequate protection. Heath had no choice but to call in the Royal Navy. On May 23, 1973, Operation Dewey began with 3 British frigates, the Cleopatra, the Lincoln and the Plymouth, entering the contested region with orders to protect the British trawlers. However, just how they were supposed to do that wasn't always clear. The frigates would position themselves behind the trawlers in an effort to block the Icelandic coast from deploying their net cutters. But if the Icelandic captain was feeling bold, he would sometimes force his way through, with the British captains not being authorized to ram them first, as the British warships, with their thinner hulls, were designed to hunt Soviet submarines and not to ram reinforced gunboats. Aiding the operation were RAF maritime patrol aircraft, who, as well as monitoring Soviet activity, also kept track of the Icelandic Coast Guard's boats. The Soviet sailors and airmen traversing the Gruik Gap must have found it amusing to see two major NATO members treating each other as enemies rather than as allies. The Icelandic government were enraged by the incursion of British warships and aircraft into what they saw as their legal territory. Once again, there were angry protests at the British embassy in Reykjavik, leading to windows being smashed and the building vandalized, while according to the US's ambassador to Iceland at the time, Frederick Irving, Prime Minister Ólafur Jóhannesson began making demands that as part of their defense agreement, the US should send jets to bomb the British frigates. Jóhannesson also cited Article 5 of NATO membership, that an attack on one member nation was an attack on all, and that by violating what they considered Icelandic territory with warships, Iceland was effectively under British invasion. The ICJ ruling helped avoid legal wrangling, but the situation was putting the US and NATO in an extremely difficult position. Meanwhile, the game of cat and mouse between the Icelandic Coast Guard and the British trawlers and their protection went on. The first collision occurred on June 1st between the Aegir and HMS Scylla, and numerous others would occur, varying in severity over the months which followed. On June 20th, the tugboat Lloydsman was acting as a buffer for a trawler out of Grimsby, when the Coast Guard vessel Odin approached. The Odin went to full power and attempted to cut across the path of the Lloydsman and to cut the trawler's net. But the Lloydsman went to full power also and instead cut off the Odin. The Odin tried reversing its engines, but it had already developed so much forward momentum that a collision was inevitable, and it struck the British supertug's starboard side. The Lloydsman had taken little damage compared to the Odin, but the situation was about to get even more dangerous as the Odin loaded its guns and began threatening to fire on the Lloydsman. It was only the arrival of a British frigate that forced the Odin to stand down. In an effort to curb the growing crisis, on September 16, 1973, NATO Secretary General Joseph Luns was forced to travel to Reykjavik in an effort to find a solution. He was met with a rather hostile reception from the Icelandic people, who felt betrayed by NATO for not forcing Britain to withdraw its warships from the disputed area. With the incident fueling nationalism and patriotism, there were calls from all over Iceland to close the base at Keflavik and to withdraw from the NATO alliance, as membership only seemed to serve foreign interests. Away from the disputed waters, events were taking place which would have a profound impact not just on the course of the Second Cod War and the UK fishing industry, but the country as a whole. On January 1st, 1973, after 10 years of negotiations, the UK joined the European Economic Community and was integrated into the common market. Prior to the UK's entry, the EEC adopted the Common Fisheries Policy, which allowed member states to fish the waters of neighbouring member states. The UK tried to resist the policy, but the founding members of the EEC made it a stipulation of membership, and thus the Heath government reluctantly accepted. Initially, the policy predominantly affected Britain's inshore fishing fleets, and many of them suffered from the increased competition. As for the long-distance offshore fleet operating around Iceland, it now became more important than ever that they retain their rights to fish within the 50-mile limit, because there were now fewer options for them on other boats if their own boats were seized or their owners had to fold. Secondly, 1973 saw the start of the Third UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which aimed to once and for all settle the disputes surrounding the size of economic exclusion zones. In 1947, the South American countries of Chile and Peru claimed zones in the region of 200 miles, and this proved profitable for both parties involved. In fact, during their own discussions for extending their own EEZ to 50 miles, the Icelandic government considered following the South American precedent and claiming the same, but was dropped on the grounds that the Icelandic Coast Guard couldn't reasonably police it. At the start of the convention, many countries were pushing support for a universal limit of 100 miles, and this would have been a major impact on the Second Cod War, for it meant that Britain was fighting to hold on to fishing grounds that within just a few years could legally be recognised as Icelandic territory anyway. As a result, and with Iceland edging ever closer to leaving the NATO military alliance, the UK position was almost untenable, and all their negotiators could hope to achieve was to limit the damage. On November 8, 1973, an agreement was reached that would limit British fishing activities to certain areas within the 50 nautical mile limit, designated by Iceland. British trawlers were limited to an annual catch of no more than 130,000 tons, which Edward Heath described as acceptable to the British press, despite initial British requests for the limit to be 145,000. Additionally, it was strictly prohibited for factory trawlers to enter the Icelandic EEZ at any time. The agreement would be in force for 2 years, after which it would be reassessed, which many feared was only delaying another inevitable confrontation if the UN Convention agreed to the 100-mile limit. Nevertheless, for the time being, the British had withdrawn their warships and tugboats, and Iceland basked in yet another victory. However, the peace that followed was an uneasy one, and the Icelandic Coast Guard were ever vigilant for rogue British trawler skippers who would continue to violate the 50-mile limit. One such skipper, who had become something of a notorious figure to them, was Richard Taylor, who had repeatedly been arrested and fined, and even imprisoned twice for fishing within the disputed waters. According to Taylor's account, on July 19, 1974, while in command of the trawler C.S. Forrester, he had left instructions with one of his crew on the bridge to maintain their course that would avoid the EEZ, and at about 3 AM he retired to his bunk for some rest. It was around 5 AM that Taylor was shaken awake by the crewmen who had come to tell him that they had been intercepted by the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Thor. When checking the position of land on the radar, Taylor realized that they had sailed within the EEZ, and that given his reputation, the Icelandic authorities would never believe that it was a mistake. They would also likely take great pleasure in putting him in prison for several years as a warning to others. He therefore decided to make a run for it and turned towards British waters with the Thor in hot pursuit. After a 100-mile chase, the CS Forrester was near the Faroese limits where they would be safe when Taylor received a radio call from the captain of the Thor, Höskuldur Schaffedinson, explaining that he had been given orders from Reykjavik to stop him at all costs. The Thor fired non-explosive shots towards the CS Forrester, which fell short of the fleeing trawler, but it was enough to let Taylor know that they meant business. Having changed the gunner on Thor, the next 2 shells struck the British trawler, including one which hit the engine room, bringing the chase to an end. The CS Forrester was immediately boarded, and Taylor was arrested. The Icelandic guardsman told him that he would be going back to prison, which for him must have been becoming something of a holiday camp. He was fined £5,000 and spent 30 days in prison before being released on bail, paid for by the boat's owners, who had to pay an additional £26,300 for the trawler's release, the equivalent of roughly £250,000 from today. Probably the worst part for Taylor was that when he expected to wake up that morning, his crew would be hauling in their catch and heading back to Hull instead of to an Icelandic cell. It was as if history was doomed to repeat itself. As the 2-year agreement with the UK was coming to an end, the Icelandic government began discussing the future of the country's vital fishing industry. Voices in the government who had called for the EEZ to be extended to 200 miles in 1972 were once again pushing for this limit to be imposed, stating that Britain and Europe would have no choice but to accept it as they had done previously. Thus, on July 15, 1975, they announced to the world their intention to extend their EEZ once more. Once again, the preservation of fish stocks was cited as the reason, but even some Icelandic scientists argued that the 50-mile limit was more important in this regard due to the cod nurseries within this region, prompting more British conspiracy theories in Europe of Icelandic collusion with the Soviet Union to weaken NATO. Others meanwhile saw it as Iceland trying to fend off the global recession that was ravaging Western economies in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis by cornering the North Sea cod market for itself. A 200-mile limit would sound the death knell for Britain's offshore fishing fleet, and the recently elected Labour government under Harold Wilson protested strongly, as did a number of European nations. However, as before, they fell on deaf Icelandic ears, and after the previous agreement ended on November 13, 1975, British trawlers found themselves once again under attack by Icelandic gunboats and their net cutters. Just 3 days after the end of the agreement, the trawler Primella had its nets cut by the Icelandic Coast Guard, thus declaring the start of the Third Cod War. With so much at stake, tempers were now positively flaring amongst the fishermen, the Icelandic Coast Guard, and the Royal Navy crews. It seemed as though this time, things had gone beyond the economic impact of whomever would emerge victorious, and now each side had something to prove. Less than 24 hours after the Primella's nets were cut, talks collapsed, marking a serious deterioration of the situation, which the Icelandic government claimed was only made worse by the return of British tugboats and warships into the newly disputed area. On December 6, 1975, the tugboat Euroman was running interference against the patrol boat Thor, but was unable to stop the cutting of the trawler's wires, after which the tug collided with the Icelandic vessel. This was claimed as a deliberate act by the Icelandics, and within days, Thor would again be damaged in a similar incident, this time with the British warship HMS Falmouth, but it was the incident that occurred on the next day, on December 11, 1975, that would spark the greatest controversy of the entire dispute. While senior diplomats from both nations were at a NATO summit in Brussels, 3 British vessels, the Lloydsman tug, the oil rig supply vessel Star Aquarius, and its sister ship, the Star Polaris, were all seeking shelter from a Force 9 gale inside Icelandic territorial waters. The vessels were operating in support of the British trawler fleet, but were not providing such support at the time. The accounts of what happened next differ depending on which side is explaining what happened. In the Icelandic account, Thor had been ordered to investigate the vessels, and when they were identified, immediately ordered them to leave Icelandic waters. The British vessels initially complied under escort by the Thor, but then after a short while, the Star Aquarius suddenly turned and rammed the gunboat. Thor increased its speed, attempting to escape, but was cut off by the Lloydsman, who proceeded to ram the significantly smaller gunboat, inflicting significant damage. Realizing they were in a British trap, the Icelandics manned their guns and fired a single round in self-defense at the Star Aquarius, which forced the tug to back off and allowed the wounded Thor to escape. However, this version is disputed by British accounts, which claim that the Icelandic Coast Guard arrived on the scene and threatened to start shooting unless the vessels surrendered. The British refused, and whilst heading out of the area, the Thor's crew attempted to board the Star Aquarius, but was prevented from doing so by the Lloydsman, resulting in the collision, after which the Thor discharged its gun. Some sources are even unclear as to which British tugboat was hit by the shell that was fired, with some Icelandic accounts stating that it was the Lloydsman and not the Star Aquarius. Regardless, both sides blamed one another for the incident, only further worsening tensions and making negotiations all the more difficult, especially as the British position had already been weakened by West Germany agreeing to limit its catch in the disputed area. The UK had tried to negotiate for a limit of 110,000 tons, but given the events taking place at sea, the Icelandics refused any more than 65,000. In January, the repaired Thor was once again involved in collisions with British vessels, some accidental and some deliberate, and both sides would later admit to being guilty of the latter. Such was the mood against opposing crews. At times, the dispute became personal, with heated exchanges over the radio between Royal Navy and Icelandic Coast Guard captains. Some Icelandic captains admitted to timing their attempts to cut nets or board trawlers to coincide with traditional meal times on British warships, if only to annoy the British crews. The Icelandic Coast Guard also recorded radio transmissions between the frigates and the trawlers, and then played them back later to confuse the trawler captains. Some Coast Guard vessels were also fitted with protrusions, known to the British as tin openers, designed to increase the damage to the relatively weak hulls of the British frigates. But more often than not, the smaller Icelandic boats came off worse from the collisions and the rammings. British warships regularly radioed their opponents afterwards with offers of help, but it was said that the Icelandic crews would rather go down with their vessels than accept help from the Royal Navy. Meanwhile, morale and support for the operation remained high amongst the British warship crews, who viewed the trawlermen as their brethren, especially since many of them had been Navy men themselves. Some British crews got a taste for ramming and were eager to get stuck in, so to speak, with British captains engineering situations so that any collision that would occur would appear the fault of the Icelandics attempting to bypass the warship to cut the nets of the trawlers. Indeed, for much of the dispute, it was the Icelandics who appeared the most aggressive, despite a fleet of heavily armed British warships operating in the region. A typical battle of the Third Cod War occurred on February 12, 1976, when HMS Diomed was attempting to block the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Balder, when the two of them became engaged in a series of rammings, neither ship willing to give up on the other. The captain of the Balder, Höskuldur Skarphedinsson, was well known to the British as an aggressive captain, and he did not disappoint the crew of the Diomed, making up to 20 attempts to bypass the warship and cut the nets of the trawlers operating nearby. During 4 of these attempts, both vessels collided, resulting in significant damage to each, with Diomed being left with a 12-foot gash in its hull, forcing it to return to port. Meanwhile, the situation on land was getting more serious by the day. British MP and Secretary of State for the Environment, and then Foreign Affairs after April 1976, Anthony Crosland, described the situation with Iceland as being of greater threat to NATO than the destabilized Middle East region. Once again, it was at the base of Keflavik that became the focus of Icelandic frustration, leading to mass protests outside the entrance. Less than a week after the incident between the Diomed and the Balder, Iceland took the dramatic step of severing diplomatic ties with the United Kingdom. Negotiations would now take place via NATO and even the UN Security Council. With neither appearing to bear any fruit, and British warships still in the disputed area, Iceland began negotiations with the US for the acquisition of 4 Asheville-class gunboats, which could be armed with anti-ship missiles. Not wanting to escalate the situation further, the US refused, and so Reykjavik played its Cold War trump card once again and approached the Soviet Union to begin negotiations for acquisitions of Merkur-class frigates. How serious the Icelandics were about the acquisition remains open to debate, as is how they would have been used if they had been acquired. What is certain, however, is that just the thought of Soviet equipment being purchased and used by one NATO ally against another member's ships had potentially global repercussions and fueled the diplomatic effort to find a resolution. Back in the UK, politicians were already becoming disenfranchised with the cost both economically and politically of the Third Cod War. With the economy damaged by the 1973 recession, the Labour government was making dramatic military cutbacks on the one hand, yet funding a large deployment of warships on the other. That funding included the repairing of the ships after they had been damaged by collisions with the Icelandic gunboats. Furthermore, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was still going on, and was by now toying with the idea of accepting 200 miles as the limit for a nation's EEZ. Thus, once again, the UK was fighting to hold on to fishing grounds that would be Iceland's by international law in just a few years anyway. Even continuing the fight as a matter of principle was damaging to Britain's prestige, as the UK looked set to profit from the 200-mile EEZ thanks to oil and gas reserves found north of Scotland. John Prescott, a Labour member of the European Parliament and himself an elected representative of both the Union of Seamen and MP for Hull, undertook an unofficial diplomatic visit to Iceland in order to begin talks with his Icelandic colleagues. The British conservative-leaning press were quick to demonize Prescott after he was pictured meeting some of the Icelandic Coast Guard captains who had been attacking British trawlers. But he showed that there were those in Britain willing to at least talk. With NATO mediation, negotiations resumed, but were almost immediately scuppered by another serious incident at sea. On the evening of May 6, 1976, the Icelandic gunboat Tyr was intercepted by the frigate HMS Falmouth as it tried to cut the nets of the trawler Carlisle. The captain of the Falmouth, Robert Plumer, advised the Tyr that his orders had been changed to give the trawlers his full protection, and when this didn't deter the Icelandic vessel, he ordered ramming speed. Colliding with the Tyr at 22 knots, the Tyr was hit with such force that it nearly capsized, and crew members were hurled against walls. Tyr managed to narrowly avoid sinking, and in an act of traditional Icelandic defiance, still made for the Carlisle, prompting the Falmouth to plow into the Icelandic vessel once again. The Tyr was now heavily damaged and had lost partial power. Fearing another ramming attack, Captain Gudmundur Kjarnested gave the orders to man Tyr's guns, threatening the British ship with firing if they tried anything again, even though the Falmouth heavily outgunned his vessel. However, Falmouth had also sustained serious structural damage on her bow, and so the two vessels slipped away to their respective bases to begin their extensive repairs. NATO's mediation was fraught with tension, as neither side was prepared to back down or to halt their operations before an agreement was reached. Finally, on June 1, 1976, an agreement was reached, allowing British warships to withdraw for the last time, as the Cod Wars were now at an end. The agreement significantly favoured Iceland, for it not only forced Britain and Europe to recognise Iceland's 200-mile EEZ, but it limited Britain to just 24 trawlers to keep fishing in the region, their catch limited to just 30,000 tons, less than half of what they had been offered the year before. The Cod Wars were devastating on the British fishing fleet, and members of the EEC, which of course would morph into the European Union, and the Common Fisheries Policy, only further eroded the industry in Britain. According to British government figures, in 1938 there were 47,000 active commercial fishermen in the UK, and this excludes many times that number employed in processing and distributing the catches. In 2021, there are just 12,000 commercial fishermen, and the industry accounts for less than 0.1% of the economy. British prestige also took something of a hit, as did national pride, with many of those ignorant of the wider picture wondering why the Royal Navy didn't just sink the Icelandic Coast Guard vessels. The Cod Wars presented a fascinating case study in demonstrating the power of a strong diplomacy over firepower, for it was the importance of Iceland's continued cooperation with NATO, and particularly the US, that ultimately won the day. Equally, had the Royal Navy not demonstrated enormous restraint in the use of their weapons, then the situation could have deteriorated rapidly, threatening the NATO alliance and possibly even altering the course of the final, crucial decades of the Cold War. Icelandic prestige didn't come off untainted either. They were viewed as being arrogant, self-centered, and a little too quick to fire their guns. The repeated threats made towards closing the base at Keflavik, and how quick they were to accept Soviet aid, made many in the NATO alliance question just where Icelandic loyalties really lay, and what would they do if the situation with the Soviets changed dramatically, leading to the threat of war. Fortunately, of course, that never came to pass. Since the late 1970s, relations between Britain and Iceland have improved significantly. In 2019, the Icelandic government expressed their gratitude for the Royal Air Force, deploying Typhoon fighter bombers to the country to guard its airspace against Russian bombers and surveillance aircraft. As for the Royal Navy, its reputation may have been tainted by the Cod Wars, but it was fully restored 6 years later when the UK undertook Operation Corporate to retake the Falkland Islands seized by Argentina. As well as its military capabilities, the Royal Navy demonstrated its extraordinary logistical skill by conducting a successful campaign some 8,000 miles from its main base in the UK. Sadly, however, the issue of fishing rights, not just in Europe but the world over, continues to pose problems for seafaring nations. In 1993, British patrol boats and French fishermen clashed numerous times concerning fishing rights in the English Channel. In the mid-1990s, Canada and Spain clashed over Spanish vessels illegally fishing for halibut and turbot in Canadian waters. Subsequently, this became known as the Turbot War, and while not as dramatic as the Cod Wars, there were firing of warning shots by Canadian vessels. With the UK now having left the European Union, the issue of fishing rights has reared its head once again, becoming an extremely heated topic in the Brexit negotiations. Time will tell just how they will affect the future trading relations between the UK and the EU, and what that would mean for enforcing those agreements.